Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the endgame with Mikhail Botvinnik's best endgames, or what are my favorite Botvinnik endgames. And the first game we are going to look at is his immortal Zugzwang game against David Bronstein, which, if you don't know it, it's a great piece of chess history. It's the position you can see on the board, and what happened in this game is absolutely incredible. After that, we are going to have a look at one of his earlier games against Alekhine in the famous AVRO tournament in 1938. And then finally, we will have a look at a game from the 1963 World Championship match where he lost the title to Petrosian. So, Botvinnik was an incredibly interesting player. He was known for his precise style, for his preparation, for his methodic play, and for basically using knowledge and chess principles to win chess games. He would often win games at home, meaning he would win with his preparation. And he was famous for being the model of the correct Soviet player, and his World Championship match against Style is famous because of the clash of styles between the two. I did not include any Tal Botvinnik games in this video, but I will make part 2 eventually. So bear in mind the 3 questions you can see on the board, same as in the previous video. We're going to be using these questions to determine what the best move or the best plan in the position is. Okay, a brief intro on the 51 World Championship match against Bronstein. So Botvinnik was the world champion at the time, and he had to draw the match to retain the title. The match ended 12-12. So Botvinnik retained the title. Bronstein later wrote that he felt pressure from the Soviet government that he had to lose the match. Not that he says, nobody told me to lose the match, but I felt that I would be harmed if I won, whatever that means. So anyway, he did lose the match. And here's a brief intro. So Bronstein opened with the Dutch, and Botvinnik was considered to be an expert on both sides of the Dutch and had prepared for that. And later on, Bronstein dismissed the Dutch as his opening. So he experimented a lot, which is not smart against Botvinnik, who was very well prepared. And the game, the match was tied. And in game 22, Bronstein had a chance to play for a win. So he should have pushed for a win in game 22, which would have given him the title, but he didn't. And so they went into game 23 with the scores being 12 Bronstein, 11 Botvinnik. So if Botvinnik could win, he would win the match. And this position, or this game, is incredibly famous because on the final move, Bronstein taught for 40 minutes before he resigned, and it's, I think, one of the most famous Zugzwang positions ever played. Okay, so we start in this endgame where Bronstein has 2 knights and the bishop, Botvinnik has 2 bishops and the knight, and Botvinnik just played knight to c1. After bishop to a3 by David Bronstein, Botvinnik loses a pawn. There is no way to save b3, because Bronstein will simply take the knight and then take the b3 pawn. However, white is better here. Why? Because the extra pawn will be a double pawn. There are double pawns on the b file. And because his king is more active, the king could get into the position without being opposed, whereas black's king will have a hard time getting towards any sensible squares, because the d4 pawn and the a4 pawn cover all the key squares. So in this position, you could consider sacrificing a pawn like this by playing b4, and then knight takes, because if bishop takes knight, then pawn takes knight. But instead, Botvinnik played king to d1. And now, after bishop takes, king takes, and knight takes b3 check, and king to c2, what happened in this position is that black is a pawn up, but white has the bishop pair. And more importantly, as I said, there are no infiltration squares for the black king. Everything is covered. You can see that the black king has no way of entering the position. The only way could be via h6, but that could easily be stopped with h4. Also, there are pawns on both sides of the board, meaning that the bishops are going to be more successful in this endgame. So the first principle when it comes to bishop pair versus knight pair endgames is the side with the bishop pair wants to open the position up, and as the position opens up, the bishops are going to become more and more powerful, and the knights are going to become, well, less powerful. Okay, knight a5 played, the knight obviously retreats, and king to c3, the king marches towards the position. King f7 played, and now let's start opening the position up, e4. And in this position, Bronstein made a mistake. When you are worse, even though he is a pawn up, he is worse because of the bishop pair, and he must have known that. You want to trade pawns off. So his next move is very dubious. I would say this is the worst move of the game, and had he played correctly, he might have had drawing chances. So, d takes e4 was the correct move, and after f takes e4, king e7 marching the king towards the position. Of course, these squares are still covered after bishop b5, so the king really has no future. However, it's going to be harder for white to win. Let's say h4, let's say king to d7, and for example bishop b5 check and king to d8. This is my analysis. And now, white, if white wants to complicate things, white has to create targets. These bishops are nice, but if they have no targets, he isn't going to win. So g5, and trying to provoke some weaknesses. Of course, if this is taken, then the king has an easy route into the position, and the bishop has a great square, and the light squared bishop could eventually be coming to g8. So in this position, f5 is probably the principled move, and now ef5, ef5, giving black a passed pawn, but the key idea here is h5. And now if this is taken, then everything is going to be dropping off. There is no way to save all the pawns. A simple bishop e2 could win one of the pawns. But if h5, then black probably plays knight c6 and hg, probably bishop c4, looking to take on g6 and king e7. And this is holdable. Black is a pawn up, and they say it's holdable for black because the bishops are so powerful. So this simplification would have made the game much easier for Bronstein to play. However, instead of that, he played the move f5, which is a dreadful move, because now after gf5 and gf5, you don't want to lose your e-pawn, and gf5, this pawn is now isolated, and the bishops have a lot more scope. So, bishop d3 played, of course defending the e4 pawn, and king g6 getting into the position, and bishop d6. Now look at these two bishops. They're completely dominating the knights. Should the knights move, for example, if this knight has no squares to move to, if the a5 knight moves, then we could start targeting the pawns, and eventually one of the knights is going to have to move. So after knight c6, now bishop b1 was played, and this is a move I had a hard time understanding, but it's after some time I managed to understand it. It's basically a Zugzwang move, saying you have no good moves here, and basically black has no good moves. Eventually this bishop could transfer to a2 and target the d5 pawn, forcing a trade here, and then entering the position. And also in this position, after let's say h5 is played, you could just take and play here, and that wins the pawn. But bishop b1 is more than playing for bishop a2, it's a Zugzwang move. Okay, king f6, defending. Bishop to g3, the bishop retreats and prepares for bishop h4 if necessary. And now Bronstein simplifies fe, and he plays h6, getting away from the glare of the bishop. Bishop f4, pressing on the target, provoking the pawn forward. Of course, if you play king g6, then takes wins immediately. h5, and now e takes d5, and h4, fixing the weakness. And now we have a very beautiful position, in my opinion. I remember looking at this position for the first time, and I thought this is just incredible. Being a pawn up in a 4-3 endgame and completely lost. I don't know whether I've seen this before, especially in a minor piece endgame. So basically, this king has no way into the position. These squares are covered. Coming to a5 is, well, not really possible. And the bishops cover all of these squares. And in the meantime, white's bishops have 3 targets 4 targets, and the knights are still completely powerless. So this is just a picture of beauty. Knight a to b8, finally getting the knight into the position, and now in this position Botvinnik starts improving his pieces. Bishop g5 check, king f7, and bishop f5. Now look at these two bishops. Of course, the knights are still completely dominated. Okay, knight a7 played, not that it makes a big difference. I think he just wanted to play b5 at some point, but that really doesn't help. Okay, bishop f4, targeting the knight, no time for b5, knight b to c6. And now simply bishop to d3, preventing b5. You don't want to allow Bronstein to liberate. Even though b5 wouldn't have equalized the position, this is just a great prophylactic move. Of course, white is still dominating the entire board. Knight c8 played, bishop e2 played, targeting h5. And now, how do you force a Zugzwang? Well, in this position h5 is attacked, king g6 has to defend the pawn. Bishop d3, a bit of repetition, king f6, and bishop e2, targeting the pawn again. Now, in this position Bronstein played king to g6. Let's just look at an alternative move. Of course, you could play king f5, gaining a tempo on the bishop, meaning that white doesn't have time to take on h5. So if king f5, then simply bishop to c7, targeting the b6 pawn, and for example king e4, double attack on d4, but this is completely lost after bishop h5, knight takes d4, bishop g6 check, and for example knight f5, and then you continue h5. And even though, again, black is still a pawn up, this pawn is going to queen. So for example d4, king d2, knight e7 for example, bishop h7, there will be no way to prevent the pawns from queening. Of course, this one is also dropping and the position is hopeless. But king f5 was a better try, I think. Still, king g6 played. And now look at what happens. Bishop f3, starting to put black in Zugzwang. Now this is attacked, the king cannot move. If the king moves, then you take on h5. So knight 6 to e7. Okay, fine. The pawn is defended. And now pause the video. What would you play here to force resignation? The next move was the final move of the game. Mikhail Botvinnik played bishop to g5, and Bronstein taught for 40 minutes before resigning. I think with 9 pieces on the board and the kings, this is a remarkable Zugzwang position. If the king moves, you take on h5. If the c8 knight moves, you take on e7. If the e7 knight moves, you take on d5. If the b6 pawn moves with b5, then a takes b5, and again you have the same Zugzwang. And it's just remarkable. This is an incredible position. So, for example, b5 takes and b6, and you simply play king d3, and it's the same Zugzwang again. You have no way to save this position. I thought this was just incredible. And coming back to the starting position, he knew that he would lose a pawn, and he knew that he was still winning. A beautiful position. Just shows how powerful the bishop pair could be against knights that have no scope when the pawns are on both sides of the board. I just loved this endgame. Okay, now let's have a look at this one. This is Botvinnik Alekhine from the AVRO tournament 1938. So, a bit of history. In 38, AVRO, which is a Dutch radio company, organized the strongest tournament in history. And this is just, the lineup was brutal. And it ran from the 6th to the 27th of November, so a lot of rounds, and it was played in Amsterdam. And what's important about this tournament is that it connected the old and the new generation. So the final scores were Paul Keres and Ruben Fine were tied for first with 8.5. Botvinnik was third with 7.5. Alekhine was fourth with 7. Max Yu was equal fourth, same as Reshevsky with 7. Capablanca came in 5th or 7th, and Salomon Floor came in 8th. So you have Capablanca, Alekhine on one side, and Keres, Botvinnik, and Reshevsky on the other side. So Keres was 21, Botvinnik and Reshevsky were 27. So you have Capablanca, who is an old-timer, and you have Keres, Botvinnik, and Reshevsky. So the new generation obviously won. Keres, fine, Botvinnik were in the first three spots. And we reached this position on move 22. Black just took on c7, the queens were white just took on c7, the queens were traded off. And it's obvious that Botvinnik is better here. There's no doubt about it. Botvinnik is better because he has a better rook, a much better rook. He has a much better knight. Obviously, this knight has no squares to go to. But how do you win this position? It's not easy to win because there are no easy targets. If you play rook b7, then b5. Rook d7 is prevented. Well, if you play knight e5, then f6. Anyway, it's black to play. If it was white to play, then knight e5 would be the best move, and after f6, knight d7 would force a trade, and then this pawn would be indefensible. However, there could be some tricks. Let's just give black a nothing move. So, yeah, in this position, this nothing move loses. Let's give black a different nothing move. Okay, let's say a5, and here. And after this trade happens, black could play for tricks with this backring trick, but king f1, and he's going to lose a pawn. So, with black to play, black has to play f6. There are two ideas behind this move. Firstly, preventing knight e5, preventing knight g5, and more importantly, preparing to go for a repetition with rook f7, rook f8, offering a trade of rooks and evicting Botvinnik's rook. So f6, very important. King f1, excellent, best move on the board, because he wants to sort out the only problem in his position, which is the weak back rank. After king f1, white has no issues in this position. Okay, now rook f7, offering a trade, rook c8 check, and rook f8. And obviously, if rook c7, then you repeat the position. So the rook does get evicted, rook c3, fine. Okay, and now Alekhine goes completely mental. It's not that it's easy to find a move in this position, but you have to try and play actively and activate your pieces. He played g5, which weakens the back rank, the 7th rank irreparably, and gives this rook much more scope if it should ever reach c7 again. I think what he should have played is rook e8, and after rook c7, because now there is no rook f7, now we can play king f8 and basically prepare for rook e7. So, for example, rook b7, b5, rook b6, getting away from rook e7, and king f7, for example. And black could hope to hold this position. Obviously, he is almost in Zugzwang, and it's very hard to move any of his pieces. At least he's not getting mated anymore, and after rook c8 and knight d7, you can give up a pawn to try and infiltrate on c2, and there is some hope. Instead, g5 was played, and now what I think is the best move in the game. So ask yourself the 3 questions you can see on the screen and try to come up with a plan for white. Okay, Botvinnik played knight e1. This is a wonderful move. Well, this is a strategically sound move which improves his worst piece. He only has 2 pieces. But the knight was poorly placed on f3 with no future. Obviously, all of these squares are covered. There would be no point of going to d2 because, again, the d5 pawn controls e4 and c4. And now maybe knight c2, knight e3 to put pressure on d5, maybe knight d3 and knight e5 or c5 if one of these pawns moves forward. So now the knight has a great future. Maybe if this pawn is provoked forward, maybe knight d3, knight f4 is also an idea, which could be basically provoked with h4. So knight e1, a wonderful move, giving the knight a lot of flexibility. h5 played, and h5 is just playing into white's hands. After knight e1, h5 is probably the worst move on the board for humans. Why? Because now you have a clear plan of knight d3, knight f4. How do you allow your knight into f4? Well, h4. And if gh4, then knight d3, and for example, king f7, knight f4, the position is collapsing. And if you don't take, well, then my pawn is great on h4, and I will eventually be able to exchange here and play something like knight f3 and get the e5 square. Obviously, if knight d7 was played in the game, you could trade straight away and just play knight f3, and after g4, well, okay, knight d7 prevents knight e5, but you get the idea. The e5 square is now available. So h4 is a great move. Knight d7 preventing knight e5 after the trade, and now instead of trading, rook c7. And in this position the knight has to be defended, so rook to f7, and now simply knight f3. And now he is prepared for the trade if need be, and entering the e5 square. So g4 played, declining the trade. The knight just drops back to e1. Why is this important? Well, if you remember the original position of the knight e1, and why playing h5 was a problem for black, it's because after knight d3, white can play h4 to free up the f4 square. In this position, after rook c7 and rook f7, and knight f3 and g4, note that the f4 square is now available. So knight f1, knight d3, knight f4, we are getting the same thing. Okay, f5, he had to react, because after knight d3 he now has to play f4. If the knight comes into f4, then it's all over. f4, and now, of course, trading would be bad, because if takes, black is probably slightly better in this endgame. I don't know. Probably. But it should be equal. So instead of that, after f4, Botvinnik played the second best move in this endgame, in my opinion. He played f3, simply blocking the advance and creating a permanent weakness. And now you can see that these three pawns are eventually going to be taken by the knight if the rook moves. Okay, gf3, gf3, a5, now another excellent move, a4. Now one pawn blocks two pawns, that's what you want to do. King f8, good move. Rook c6, and now there are simply too many targets. And this rook is going to come to h6, or the rook is going to come to d6. It's over. King e7, defending the knight, freeing up the rook, and now simply king f2, improving his king. Rook f5, b3, waiting, no need to rush anything, his position is perfect. King d8, Alekhine waits. King e2, improving the king a bit more. Knight b8 evicts the rook and gives up a pawn. I mean, you could take on b6, but he plays a much better move. He plays rook g6, and this leaves his pieces active, and also sometimes prepares rook g5, and also with knight e5 coming, there is no salvation for black. King c7, defending b6, knight e5, knight a6, looking at the b4 square. Ooh. I mean, it doesn't matter, the knight on b4 won't be doing anything. And now rook g7 check, king c8, and knight c6, and that threatens the rook, so rook f6. Knight e7 check anyway, and now we pick up the pawn after king b8. Knight takes, and the position is collapsing. So this seems like an extremely easy conversion, and it was for Botvinnik. So the game finished rook d6, rook g5 defending, knight b4, knight takes, a takes, rook h5, rook c6, rook b5, king c7 takes, and in this position Alekhine resigned. So the end was fairly easy, but coming back to the original position, all of his moves were absolutely perfect, and he just dominated the position completely without leaving well, a smidget of hope to Alekhine, and he utilized his advantages perfectly. Okay, now the final game I would like to show you is the game played between Botvinnik and Petrosian in '63. This is when Botvinnik had finally lost his world championship. I think Petrosian won 12.5, 8.5. And Botvinnik wrote about this world championship. It was really hard to play Tigran. The thing is that he had a somewhat different understanding of positional play. He went deeper into it than usual, and myself, a universal player, did not completely understand Tigran's way and depth of judgment, although I was judging all positions well. To be honest, I'm not really sure what that means. It sounds like a compliment to Petrosian, or it sounds like he's trying to find an excuse, but Petrosian definitely was at his peak in 63. And this game is famous because it features an extremely complicated rook endgame, which we're going to reach soon. And it took me a long time to understand it. I used the engine to understand it. It did not help at start. Then finally I did manage to see what was going on, and I'll try to explain it. So basically, this is a knight versus bishop rook endgame, where both sides have 5 pawns, and where white again is better after hg5 because he has fixed the king side, and because the knight has a lot of squares and is much better than the bishop. So whatever happens, white has a much better minor piece. a4 was played in this position by Petrosian. That's a good move. If you play a nothing move, then a4 from white could be a problem. Maybe not straight away because of rook c3, even though after rook c3 you could simply play b4 and it's fine. But definitely a4 is a positional threat from white at some point. So a4 by Petrosian here. Okay, ba4 played, rook c4 attacking the pawn, and now there are 2 ways to play this position. A very tempting move is knight b2, which wasn't played. Knight b2 is just a bad move. If you play knight b2, then eventually it's going to be very hard to keep the pawns because of rook c3. Now, for example, king g3 and rook a3, and you have no way of defending everything. If you move the knight, you lose the a4 pawn. If you don't move the knight, you lose the a2 pawn. So, for example, rook d3 and rook a2 would be good for black. So after rook c4, Botvinnik played the best move, a5, liquidating. And, of course, this has to be taken, ba5, and now knight c5. Notice that the move a5 gave the knight an excellent square. So this is positionally very, very strong. a5, ba5, knight c5. Okay, the bishop is attacked, goes to f5, great. The bishop looks nice, but it's going to be hard to play with that bishop against the knight, even though there are pawns on both sides of the board. King g3, a4, and now you may be tempted to play a3 to stop this pawn from moving forward and to fix it as a target, but the thing is that the pawn is on a light square. It's going to be easy to defend it. For example, if a3, rook c3 could come immediately, and then bishop c2 could defend the pawn if need be. So instead of that, after a4, simply king f4. And this king is now marching into the position. Best move, a3, fine. King e5, and now look at the difference between the 2 kings. If you've ever seen a Ben Feingold video, then you will know that he emphasizes king activity in the endgame, and this is a great example of that. Rook b4 played, and one downside of allowing a4, a3 is that after rook b4, black can play rook b2 and try to win his pawn, where obviously in this position, if you play king takes d5, if you just take the pawn, then rook b2 is actually a draw, or if you're not careful, you can lose. So if you take the rook, you lose. There's no way to stop the pawn. And after, for example, rook d1, rook takes a2, this is a draw. This pawn is too strong, this rook is too active, and white has no way to win this position. In fact, white could easily lose this position if he's not careful. So after rook b4, great prophylaxis by Botvinnik, knight d3. Excellent. Now, if bishop takes, rook b2, you can take on a3. Let me show you that. So here takes, rook b2 doesn't work because of rook a3, and white wins. So the rook is attacked, rook b2 is prevented, so rook b5, defending the d5 pawn. And now what do you do? How do you make progress? Knight c5 doesn't make much sense because rook b2. And again, we have the same drawn position. You're not afraid of bishop d3. Playing f4 doesn't make much sense, so improve your king. So king to d6. You don't want to play king f6 because after the check you won't be able to take, and you could actually get in trouble. So here, and you would have to go back. Moving forward would be risky. So king d6. King f7, king c6 attacking the rook. And now finally, since there is nothing better in this position, Petrosian decides to trade the bishop for knight. I mean, what do you do? You can play rook b8, but that doesn't really help. So bishop d3, rook b2, rook a3. This trade happens, and rook g2. Okay, fine. Rook g2 is a good move, targeting the pawn, and after king d5, rook g5 check, and king c6. Okay, now this is the famous rook endgame, and I would like to invite you to pause this video and think about this position. This is an extremely complex rook endgame in which white is better, but he's not simply winning. With perfect play, the engine would win from here, but I'm not sure it would win every time. I cannot be certain. Because black has a lot of counterplay with his h-pawn, this is very complicated. So, pause the video, try to find a plan for black. Okay, so obviously you have to push your pawn, so the first move is easy to find, h5, that was played in the game by Petrosian. And now d5, moving the pawn forward, and rook to g2. Rook g2 is a good move, because it prepares to get behind the d-pawn, it prepares to grab the a-pawn if the rook should move away from the a-file, and also perhaps target the f3 pawn. Also, it means that this pawn is a bit more supported when it moves forward. d6 played, rook c2, good move, king d7, and h4, good move. And now, what do you do with white here? There's only one move that's, well, plays for an advantage, and that's f4. f4 is important because it simply prevents h3. Of course, if black loses the h4 pawn, then it's all over. And in this position, Petrosian basically lost the game. He played a very imprecise move after which the position was just lost. After a long time, I found a move that draws, and I found a plan that draws. So pause the video again, and you're playing black here, draw the game. It's hard, but there is a way. Okay, I'll just show you what happened in the game first. He played rook f2, and after king c8, he took on f4, and after rook a7, he resigned. Why? Well, after rook a7, you play king f6, for example, and d7, and if rook c4 check, then rook c7, and the pawn queens on the next turn. After rook c8, rook f2, king c8, if you try rook c2 instead, rook c2 check, then king d8, the pawn is going to advance one square further up the board, rook d2 attacks the pawn, d7, this is still winning, king f6, for example, and king e8, eventually you will be able to block. It took me a long time to analyze all of this. It could be a bit too much, I'm sorry about that, but bear with me. So rook e2 check, king f8, rook d2. Seems that black is able to hold, but rook a6 check forces the king either to f5 or to e6. If the king goes to e6, then, excuse me, that's illegal. But if it was, then king e8 would win. King f5, king e7. Now again, rook e2, you want to force the king back, and king f7. Now you can see that the white king has made progress and that the black king has been evicted. That's the point. And now after rook d2, this is a simple win. Rook f6 check, forcing the king farther back, king g4, and now simply king e8. And whatever happens, rook e2, king f7, rook d2, king e7, and you basically built a bridge, and if check, then rook e6 wins. So, after f4, rook f2 loses whatever happens, and Botvinnik won the game. The drawing move, incredibly, was king f6. Why? Because this gives black just enough counterplay to draw. You will be holding this pawn with rook d2 and checks on e2 and c2. So the d6 pawn is held. What can you do here? Well, there are two key moves I was looking at, rook h3 and king e8. These seem like the best moves. Let's have a look at rook h3 first. If rook h3, of course, if you take this pawn, then it's over. You cannot take the pawn because the rook is coming from this side. So there are two sensible moves, king f5 and g5. g5 I think is best, and it leads to an easy draw, because this now has to be taken, and after takes, and for example a4, rook a2, this is a dead draw. This is just a dead draw. There is no way to make progress in this position. Also, after rook h3, you could play king f5, and after rook h4, rook a2, again, a dead draw. For example, king e7, rook d2, let's say d7, rook e2 check, king d8 or king d6, doesn't matter, you will just be checking. This rook is too slow. Also, after king e7, you could just play rook e2 check, king d7 and rook a2 and check from the sides. And again, this is a drawn rook and pawn endgame. And the other thing that white might try after king f6 is king e8, which draws all the same. Doesn't seem like it's a draw, but it's a draw. So there are two ways to play this position. You can play king f5, again, giving yourself counterplay, or you can play rook e2 check. King f5 is easy, because after d7 you check, king d8 and king takes f4, and this pawn is very quick. And obviously you will be able to either prevent white from queening or give up your rook, because this pawn is too quick. And if after king e8 you play rook e2 check, it's drawing all the same. King d8, rook d2, d7, and now king f5, and we reach the same position. So this is an incredibly complex rook endgame in which I think the counterintuitive king f6, getting your king away from the promotion square, is a move that's very hard to find, and I can understand why Petrosian did not find it. So I hope you learned something from this. I think this is very instructive, and that we should all take lessons from this game. Okay, thank you for watching. Hope you liked the video. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.